Hi, I'm Patricia Allingham Carlson, and this is how I painted my watercolor pink lotus blossom, a flower that's all pink and growing in the scuzzy waters of a pond. Interesting, this flower itself is as big as a child's head when it blooms. It's just enormous, and yet it's so delicate, the petals so fragile looking. It was very interesting to paint. The lotus represents purity. And that's interesting, coming from the mucky waters of the pond as it did. We have a small backyard pond that my husband dug out, and we lined with rocks we found in various places and planted with lilies and put some fish in there. And it's just beautiful. We really enjoy the tranquility. I hope you liked my video. Give it a thumbs up. Now let's paint. I had in mind to paint this lily out, this lotus out, petal by petal. So I sketched the petals in with some light watercolor paint. And then I moved right to the background because painting the background first works best for me. I don't always do it, but it works best. I began by dabbing in just some clear water with my brush. Onto the clear water, I dotted in concentrated colors like sap green, hooker's green dark, some yellow, and some indigo. The reason to dot them in is because I want them to look textured and feathery and not solid. This also helps me to concentrate the paint in specific areas, because if I just dot it in or place it in, it doesn't spread as far. I wanted the background tree to go from very dark shadowed places to much lighter lit up places. Then I repeated the same steps on the left side of the upper portion of the background. I'm being careful to paint around the flower. I did not use masking for this painting. Since the flower is such a light color, I did not want to get green mixed in with paint, with pink and white. So I'm being careful. Once this color was into my satisfaction, I began working on the bottom background. I'm using some very pale sap green and cadmium yellow paint to sketch out the plant leaves. This particular flower has huge leaves, and they have a very distinctive formation with the veins that go through them. I'm trying to keep those veins open until later so that I can paint on top and make them the appropriate color. But at this stage, I'm blocking in where I want the leaves to go. And I'm ready to begin on the flower. I've used several different kinds of approaches to the petals of this flower. The first one that I tried was to wet the whole petal in with just plain water. Add my color, and then drop in some more intense color where I wanted it to be darker. Again, if you just drop the paint in and don't spread it around, it's going to tend to stay in that spot and be a little darker where you leave it. Of course, if you want to spread it around and that works for you, that's fine. Now at this edge of this petal, I'm removing paint with a damp, clean brush. And you can see how I've restored that white edge there on that little petal. And once it's dry, I'm adding some additional shading to show that the petal is curled with a lighter edge. Each of these petals did tend to cup inward. So I'm trying to show those edges as well as the darker shading inside and toward the center. My approach, again, is petal by petal, and I'm starting with all the petals that are overlapped. The petals doing the overlapping, I'll take on second. And the ones in the center, which are the foremost petals and doing all of the overlapping, I will take on last. The outer petals are showing up as very, very pale because most of the sunlight is reaching them. There was a little section here where I'm painting now where one petal is overlapping the other and the shadow of it is showing through the under petal. So I'm finding an interesting challenge in taking this one on. Some of these petals show little tiny veins running through and ripple marks. So I'm painting them on in those petals and trying to make them very soft with a lot of water washing out. The tips of many of these flower petals were very, very pink. So that was where I was concentrating the most color. The center of this flower has a huge, beautiful seed pod forming, and it's very golden yellow. Even on the petals where it doesn't show, it reflects its golden light. And so you see me beginning to bring in that yellow gold reflection. I also skip around with the petals because I don't want to paint one petal and have it all wet and then paint the one right next to it because then it's going to run together. So I'm doing overlap and I'm doing skipping around the picture. I'm doing shading, I'm doing blending, and I'm doing a lot of softening with a damp brush. The colors I'm using for this are Permanent Rose, Alizarin Crimson, Quin Violet, and some Quin Magenta. This big petal way up front had some very challenging folds in it. And you'll see me working with that a lot with the veins and the formations of the petals, which is what you see me sketching in now to try to understand just how those folds are going together. All of these will be softened, and I'm sketching them in very lightly with the watercolor, not with heavy paint. I'm back to this big front petal that curves in such an unusual way. I'm looking closely at the little veins that go through it, and they're helping me to understand how to show the formation of it and how it curls. While that's drying, I move to the background and I'm doing some darkening. I'm using a mixture of Hooker's Green Dark and Indigo. And you can see I've deepened the color of the veins in the leaves so they keep that unique formation. Sort of like sun rays moving outward. And they're sort of exciting in their formation, so I wanted to make sure I used them for the painting. I'm deepening the color and the veins on some of the tips of the petals, and I've also brought in just a little bit of ultramarine blue. It's mixing nicely with the magenta and with the pink to make a lovely lavender color. After painting in these veins on the front petal, I'm softening them and I'm beginning to add a little bit more color. And when I say soften, I always mean with a damp brush. I want them to be blendy and not liney. Along the edge, there's a thin line of very light color, and I'm trying hard to keep that. As the flower moves inward and becomes overlapped, it gets darker in color. And I'm adding these colors very gradually. And back to the front petal, which now curls off in a different direction entirely. Can you see how I'm trying to show the curls and curves of how the flower folds by using these directionality lines? But I'm not using them heavily. I'm trying to keep them soft, just to suggest where they go. Now this is the petal where the shadow is showing through. And I had some fun playing around with that color. And to this curly petal in the front, which goes off in a different direction now, I'm applying the color as I see it. There's definitely some violet and some ultramarine mixed in some spots, along with the pink. And I'm slowly adding these colors and building them up. When all the petals are done, I'm going to be going back and glazing or building up more layers of color where they're needed. This was actually a soothing painting to do because the colors were so easy and so peaceful. But the curly petals were an interesting challenge. The stem on this flower was quite dark. I don't want to make it all one solid color though. I want to make it look like it's rounded, like a cylinder. So I'm trying very carefully to leave some lights in it. I put the dark in and then I remove a little color and mainly keep it darker on both edges. Then it doesn't look quite so solid and so flat. And I'm adding another layer of darkness to my shadows as well. Where those pops of dark accent are, I'm hoping will show or set off the lightness and the fragility of the flower. Now I'm working into the very last flower petal. I'm putting in the directionality veins to show me the way it curls and twists. And this petal is a little complicated because it twists inward and curls under the very center. The easier parts are the outer parts of the petal. And I've already painted in the pinker tip and coming down the main part. And when you paint veins into a flower petal or a leaf, the petals especially, it's good to keep them a little irregular so they don't look just stripy and geometric, but rather more natural and organic. Where the petal goes inward and it gets a little darker, and where it curves outward and catches more light, it's a lighter petal. In many places where I want the petal to be slightly shadowed or recessed, I'm putting in more cool colors, like the ultramarine and the violet. So you're seeing me painting in the Glaze Colors, which is the layer, and then blending it with a damp brush and water. Here I'm adding a deeper shadow into the place where the flower petal is overlapped, and I'm doing the same again around the painting. Sometimes a third, a fourth, or even a fifth glaze of color goes on. I'm approaching this one in very light glazes because I want to keep the whole flower color delicate and light. And yet there are places where the flower is much darker, and I want to include them for the sake of accent and shading and making the flower more interesting. It's taking quite a while to build up these glazes and making sure they're in the right place to suit me. And everybody else might see this flower differently. Now, one challenge I found particularly daunting in this flower was the center part, where the petals intertwine and curve under each other. I had my iPad and looking at my image, I made the image as large as I could and tried to really analyze how these petals came together in the center, how they turned, how they folded underneath. So I would put down the layer of brighter color for the shadow, and then I would soften it. I did that probably 5 or 6 times for that little center. While it was drying, I went back and added some more layers of color to the background to make some areas a little bit more intense or dark in color. My next step for that patch of leaves off of the tree in the background was to soften all the edges with a damp brush because I did not want the edges to be hard. My reasoning for that was that they are off in the distance. Things in the distance should have a very soft focus. Things up closer can have a much harder focus. So, a lot of softening was going on, and you can see how it looks as I do it. Once dry, I went back to soften my shading that I had just added to make sure it was bright enough, but then it came down into the petal a little bit and wasn't just a line. The little tiny center I had to take some paint off of because it was actually very light in color. And then that had to dry again. So looking at each petal and how it terminated in the very center just took some time, and I finally got it to my satisfaction. Minute adjustments at this point, softening the lines, softening some of the edges of the petals. I'm bringing in my color wheel briefly to see if any more colors are needed. And I decided that a little more blue was needed. So I went back into my ultramarine blue. I think what got my eye going was that I had made some almost orange coloring in the center. And since blue is a complement to orange, it now looked like it was needed to make the flower look a little bit more complete. So you can see where I'm adding some blue into the shadows and on some of the edges of the flowers. Not everywhere, but in a couple places for some pops of blue coloring. Tiny adjustments here and there, softening lines, softening colors. And this is where it becomes a questionable thing. Am I done or am I not done? And I did a video on that actually, how to tell if your painting's done. And sometimes it just helps to put your brush down and get away from it for a little while at this point. But when you're as close to finishing as I was, I just wanted to get it finished now. And you can always do some more work the next day. It's finished. I'm going to sign it and say it is done. I hope you enjoyed watching how I painted pink lotus blossom. It was a fun and interesting flower to paint, and I'd never done one just quite like it before. It would be real helpful if you'd give it a thumbs up and ring the bell and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. There's also some links below that you can check out. Links to different things and projects I'm involved with, my Facebook art page, my blog, products I like to use when I paint, and some art products that I make. Until next time, I'll see you and keep on painting.